January 1943. High above the Pacific. The air is thin at 25,000 feet. Sunlight scatters across a pale blue sky, sharp and cold. Below, the ocean stretches endlessly, calm and indifferent. Far ahead, a formation appears, large, boxy, slow. From the cockpit of a Japanese fighter, it almost looks unreal. Four-engined American bombers. Heavy and deliberate, holding altitude with stubborn confidence, they do not weave, they do not scatter, they fly straight, level, unafraid. To veteran Japanese pilots, raised on speed and agility, the sight borders on arrogance. These machines are too big. Too slow. Easy prey, hands tighten on control sticks, engines surge as fighters climb to intercept. This is the kind of target Japanese air doctrine was built to destroy individual bombers. Shattered by precision attacks, their crews falling into the sea below, but as the distance closes, something feels wrong. The bombers do not break formation. Gun turrets begin to glint in the sun. White lines start to form in the sky, condensation trails. Multiplying, overlapping, filling the air, what was laughter moments ago begins to fade. Because this encounter is not just about aircraft. It is about two radically different ideas of war, colliding for the first time at altitude, and the world that produced those ideas is already burning. By early 1943, the war in the Pacific had already shed its illusions. What began with speed and shock had slowed into distance, logistics, and attrition. Just 30 months earlier, Japan had struck first, across thousands of miles from Pearl Harbor to the Philippines. Japanese forces moved with precision and confidence. Their air arm was the sharpest blade in the empire's arsenal. Japanese naval aviation doctrine had been shaped in the interwar years by one belief above all others. Training was brutal. Selection was unforgiving. Only a fraction of candidates ever earned their wings. Those who did were drilled relentlessly in aerial combat, navigation, and formation flying. By 1941, Japanese carrier pilots were among the most experienced combat aviators in the world. Their primary weapon reflected that philosophy. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero was light, agile, and deadly. It could outturn anything in the sky. It climbed fast. It carried experienced men who trusted their instincts more than instruments. Early victories reinforced everything Japanese leadership believed about air warfare. American and Allied aircraft fell quickly. Bombers were intercepted, isolated, and destroyed one by one. Against this, speed and maneuver won every time. But the Pacific War was not static. While Japan expanded outward, the United States was mobilizing inward. In Washington, the war was already being fought on drafting tables and factory floors. American planners did not expect to win by producing better pilots. They expected to win by producing more aircraft, flown by crews trained to operate as part of a system. This difference in philosophy would shape everything that followed. American air doctrine, influenced by pre-war theorists, placed its faith in strategic bombing, not precision strikes by elite individuals but massed formations, flying high, mutually supporting one another. Bombers would defend themselves. Fighters would extend their reach later. At the center of this thinking stood a four-engined aircraft that many doubted before it ever flew in combat, the B-17 Flying Fortress. It was slow compared to fighters, large, ungainly, and heavily armed. To Japanese pilots accustomed to slicing through twin-engine bombers, the idea that such a machine could survive without escort seemed laughable. Early intelligence reports reinforced this belief. American bombers were said to be rigid, predictable, vulnerable. But what intelligence could not fully capture was scale. By 1942, American factories were producing aircraft at a pace no other nation could match. Training programs expanded rapidly. Crews were taught procedures, not improvisation. Survival depended on staying in formation, holding altitude, following orders even under fire. A turning point in perception came gradually, then suddenly. The Battle of Midway had already shown Japan that skill alone could not compensate for losses. Experienced pilots, once lost, could not be replaced quickly. Training pipelines were too slow, the margin for error was shrinking. At the same time, American air operations were pushing deeper into contested airspace. High-altitude bombing missions increased. Formations grew larger. Encounters became more frequent and more unsettling. Japanese pilots began reporting something unusual. Bombers that did not scatter under attack. Interlocking defensive fire. Approaches that resulted in damaged fighters rather than shattered bombers. At first, these reports were dismissed. Doctrine said the bombers should fall. Experience said they always had. But war has a way of testing beliefs without mercy. And as American bomber formations continued to appear higher, denser, and more disciplined, it became clear that this was no longer a contest of individual skill alone. It was becoming something else entirely, a confrontation between precision and production, between tradition and industrialized warfare. And the pilots waiting on the tarmac knew the next encounter would decide which vision of air combat would survive the sky. By mid-1943, the Pacific Air War was being reshaped far from the front lines, not in cockpits, not in briefing rooms, but in factories, training fields, and command offices spread across the continental United States. American war planners understood a hard truth early. The Pacific was too vast for improvisation. Distances were unforgiving. Losses were inevitable. Victory would depend on replacing men and machines faster than the enemy could destroy them. The United States did not try to preserve an elite few. Pilot training programs expanded at unprecedented speed. Thousands of young men moved through standardized curricula primary, basic advanced learning procedures, formation discipline, and instrument flying. They were not taught to duel, they were taught to function as part of a formation. Bomber crews trained the same way. Pilots, co-pilots, navigators, bombardiers, gunners, each position rigidly defined. Survival depended on coordination, not heroics. This approach extended into aircraft design. American heavy bombers were built to fly high, absorb punishment, and defend themselves. The B-24 Liberator, joining the B-17 in increasing numbers, carried long-range and heavy bomb loads across open ocean and hostile territory. Its mission profile accepted losses, but assumed they could be replaced. Japanese intelligence officers took note of the growing numbers, but underestimated the implications. Reports focused on aircraft performance, speed, climb rate, armament. What they missed was doctrine. American bomber formations were not designed to evade interception. They were designed to endure it. At high altitude, these formations flew in tight boxes. Each aircraft covered another's blind spots with overlapping fields of fire. Approaching fighters were forced into predictable attack paths head-on or from the rear, where concentrated defensive fire was most lethal. Japanese fighter tactics, perfected against isolated targets, suddenly faced a problem. Close range, turning engagements were impossible against a wall of machine gun fire. Energy was lost climbing to altitude, ammunition was expended quickly, damage accumulated with every pass. Meanwhile, attrition told its own story. Japan's pilot training system could not keep pace. Where pre-war training had produced a small number of exceptionally skilled aviators, wartime acceleration diluted experience. New pilots entered combat with fewer hours, less gunnery practice, and limited formation training. Losses were no longer just aircraft, they were irreplaceable experience. American losses, by contrast, were absorbed by scale. Crews rotated, aircraft were repaired or replaced, lessons were documented, analyzed, and fed back into training and tactics. By late 1943, something subtle had shifted in the air. Japanese pilots still believed they could win individual engagements, but they no longer believed they could stop the formations. Bomber streams grew larger, altitudes increased. Routes became more predictable, not because Americans were careless, but because predictability allowed coordination. Then came the missions that forced the issue. Large-scale, daylight bombing operations began pushing into airspace once considered secure. Intercept reports multiplied. And with them, a troubling pattern emerged. Fighters returning damaged, low on ammunition, their pilots shaken. They spoke of skies filled with white streaks, condensation trails crossing and recrossing until depth perception vanished. A fire that came not from one aircraft, but from dozens at once. Laughter, once common when heavy bombers appeared, began to disappear from ready rooms. Because the next encounter would not be a test of agility or courage. It would be a test of whether individual skill could survive contact with industrialized air power. And that test was about to reach its breaking point. Japanese fighter pilots entered. these encounters with absolute confidence in their abilities. Most had trained for years before seeing combat. They had learned to read the sky, to sense an opponent's weakness in a fraction of a second. In earlier battles, this skill had been decisive. Against scattered bombers and poorly coordinated escorts, Japanese pilots dictated the fight. They chose when to engage, when to break away, when to finish a crippled enemy. But high above the Pacific in 1943, the rules changed. Climbing to bomber altitude cost speed and fuel. By the time contact was made, fighters were already at a disadvantage. There was no isolated target to exploit. Every approach funneled them into overlapping arcs of fire. Pilots who had once closed to point-blank range now found themselves forced to fire from farther out, breaking away sooner than instinct demanded. Hits were scored, but bombers kept flying. Meanwhile, fighters returned with holes in wings and fuselages, control cables frayed, engines leaking oil. For the first time, mastery of the individual aircraft was not enough. The sky itself had become hostile. And that realization struck at the core of Japanese air culture. Inside the bomber, the experience was very different. American crews did not expect elegance. They expected violence and repetition. Training had emphasized one principle above all others: hold formation. No matter the flak. No matter the fighters. Breaking formation meant death, not just for one aircraft, but for others relying on its guns. At altitude, oxygen masks froze to faces. Engines droned at constant power settings for hours. Gunners scanned assigned sectors endlessly, knowing that a single missed approach could be fatal. When Japanese fighters attacked, there was no chasing. No maneuvering. Only procedure. Call out the contact. Track the target. Fire in controlled bursts. Bomber crews learned to trust the system. They rarely saw the full fight. Only brief flashes of enemy aircraft crossing their field of view. Tracer fire stitching the sky, contrails thickening into a white haze. Fear was constant, but it was managed. Each man knew his task. And as long as everyone held position, the formation lived. On paper, Japanese fighters still held the advantage. Aircraft like the Nakajima Ki-43 Hayabusa were lighter and more maneuverable than anything escorting the bombers. They climbed well, they turned tightly, but they were not built to absorb punishment. American heavy bombers, by contrast, were designed around redundancy: multiple engines, self-sealing fuel tanks. Armor protecting vital crew positions. And, most importantly, defensive armament placed to create overlapping fire zones. Speed could avoid danger, but structure could endure it. As encounters multiplied, this difference became decisive. Fighters might score hits, but they paid for every approach. And the bombers, slow and methodical, continued onward. Technology had not replaced courage. It had reorganized it. And as commanders on both sides studied these encounters, they began to understand that the fight in the sky was no longer about who flew better, but about whose system could survive contact longer. That realization would soon reshape decisions at the highest levels. For Japanese commanders, the early months of the Pacific War had validated long-held assumptions. But bomber formations challenged those assumptions in ways doctrine had not anticipated. Reports from returning pilots described concentrated defensive fire, high-altitude formations, and heavy losses for minimal results. Yet at higher levels, these accounts were often filtered through expectation. If bombers were surviving, the explanation had to be tactical failure, not doctrinal weakness. Orders emphasized renewed aggression. Closer attacks, repeated passes. Greater determination. What leadership struggled to accept was that courage was no longer the limiting factor. Formation spacing was adjusted. Gun placements were refined. Procedures were standardized across units. Decisions were not built around preserving individual brilliance, but around improving the resilience of the whole. Japanese intelligence had tracked American aircraft production, but numbers alone did not tell the full story. Reports categorized bombers by speed and armament. They did not account for mass employment. Nor did they fully appreciate how American training pipelines turned replacement crews into functional units in months rather than years. When interception data showed bombers returning despite multiple attacks, analysts assumed luck or poor gunnery. The possibility that the system itself was working as designed was slow to register. By the time intelligence assessments began to shift, Bomber formations had already become routine. Perhaps the most profound impact was not physical, but mental. Japanese pilots were accustomed to seeing results. An attack led to a kill, a mistake led to death. Against bomber formations, effort no longer guaranteed outcome. Multiple attack runs might yield nothing. Meanwhile, defensive fire accumulated damage relentlessly. This unpredictability eroded confidence. Pilots spoke of white skies contrails layered upon contrails, depth perception lost, orientation compromised. In such conditions, even veterans felt disoriented. The laughter that once greeted slow bombers faded from ready rooms. In its place came calculation, caution, and doubt. And when doubt enters the cockpit, doctrine begins to unravel. These pressures converged as bomber operations expanded in scale and frequency. Each mission added strain. Each interception chipped away at belief. The stage was now set for a decisive encounter. One that would force both sides to confront the reality of what modern air warfare had become. The decisive encounters did not arrive with surprise. They arrived with repetition. By late 1943, American bomber formations were no longer probing attacks. They were deliberate, scheduled operations, planned to test, then exhaust Japanese interception capacity. On the morning of one such mission, radar warnings and visual sightings confirmed what pilots already sensed. The bombers were coming again. High altitude. In numbers. As Japanese fighters scrambled, the climb alone imposed its penalty. Engines strained upward through thinning air, burning fuel before contact was even made. By the time the formations came into view, the bombers were already arranged layered boxes stretching across miles of sky. From a distance, they seemed almost static, large aircraft holding steady against the wind, contrails forming long white scars behind each engine. The sky began to lose depth, becoming a flat, blinding canvas. Intercept orders were clear, attack from ahead where closing speed was highest. Break through the formation. Force bombers to scatter. But as the first fighters committed, the illusion of vulnerability vanished. But coordinated streams of tracer rounds arcing outward from multiple aircraft at once. Approach corridors narrowed. Attack angles collapsed into predictable lanes of fire. Pilots pressed on anyway. Some scored hits, brief flashes against aluminum skin, smoke trailing from damaged engines. Yet the bombers held course. They did not peel away. They did not fall out of formation. Instead, the formations absorbed the attack and closed ranks. Japanese fighters, lighter and faster, were forced to break away sooner than planned. Crews followed procedure. Gunners tracked assigned sectors. Pilots held speed and altitude. Navigators kept eyes on instruments, not the chaos outside. The sky filled with condensation trails from both sides. For Japanese pilots, this was unfamiliar territory. Combat had always rewarded awareness and instinct. Now the environment itself stripped those advantages away. As successive attack waves failed to break the formation, something fundamental shifted. This was not an enemy that could be defeated by courage alone. It was a machine, systematic, layered, relentless. And as fuel gauges dipped and fighters turned for home, the bombers continued onward, unbroken. The moment of realization was not dramatic. It was quiet, because for the first time, Japanese pilots understood they were not stopping the mission, they were merely surviving it, and the bombers were still flying. As the bomber formations pushed deeper, the sky transformed. Contrails multiplied until the blue above became a web of white. Each engine left its mark, lingering in the thin air, stacking layer upon layer. From the ground, it looked like a storm that never moved. From inside the cockpit, it erased distance, altitude, and certainty. This was the moment Japanese pilots later remembered most clearly. Tracer rounds stitched across the sky, converging from multiple directions at once. Some pilots pressed in closer, determined to prove the bombers could still be broken. They aimed for cockpits, engines, wing roots. A few bombers faltered. Losses mounted on both sides, but asymmetrically, every damaged bomber required concentrated effort from multiple attackers. Every damaged fighter reduced interception strength for the next wave. Fuel exhaustion forced disengagements, ammunition ran dry. The bombers flew on. Inside the formations, crews saw the sky turn pale and indistinct, then shifted to secondary positions. Pilots maintained course through turbulence and shock waves from nearby explosions. The bombers had not merely survived, they had imposed their terms on the battle. The white sky became more than a visual memory. It became a psychological boundary. On one side stood a doctrine built on individual mastery. On the other, a system designed to function under punishment. When the formations finally turned back toward base, gaps in the sky closed slowly. Contrail's thin dot silence returned, but something had been left behind at altitude. A certainty had broken. And as Japanese pilots landed, inspecting damaged aircraft and counting missing comrades, the consequences of that moment would unfold not in hours, but in months. Written in altered tactics, shifting strategies, and a growing imbalance that no amount of skill could fully correct. The damage became clear only after the engines shut down. Aircraft returned riddled with holes. Control surfaces were torn, oil streaked across fuselages and wings. Ground crews counted impacts and noted what could be repaired and what could not. Losses were recorded carefully. Japanese interception units reported fighter attrition that outpaced replacement aircraft. Pilots wounded or worse were removed from already thinning rosters. The bombers had taken losses as well. But the formations as a whole remained intact. Command assessments reflected an uncomfortable reality. Interception had not prevented mission completion. Defensive fire from bomber formations inflicted disproportionate damage on attacking fighters. For Japanese planners, this posed a dilemma. Existing tactics demanded repeated close-range attacks exactly, the conditions that maximized bomber defensive strength. Meanwhile, American after-action reports painted a different picture. Losses were analyzed, but confidence grew. Formations worked, discipline held, procedures proved survivable even under sustained attack. Adjustments were made at the margins. Formation spacing tightened or loosened. Gun coverage was evaluated. Crew coordination refined. The larger conclusion was unmistakable. High-altitude mass bombing could continue. As these assessments circulated, the operational tempo increased. Missions became routine rather than exceptional. Each sortie normalized the imbalance. Japanese pilots, once the decisive factor in air combat, now faced a grinding reality. Skill could still achieve victories, but not control outcomes. The aftermath was not marked by a single announcement or doctrine change. It unfolded quietly through reports, briefings, and the silent arithmetic of losses. And with each mission that returned unbroken, the strategic weight shifted further away from interception toward inevitability. That shift would soon force deeper changes, not just in tactics, but in how the air war itself was understood. As weeks turned into months, the pattern hardened. Japanese air units adjusted where they could. Intercepts were attempted at lower altitudes when possible. Attacks emphasized speed over persistence. Some units experimented with heavier weapons or different approach angles, but these adaptations came too late, and with diminishing returns. Every change demanded training. Every new tactic required coordination. And coordination required time Japan no longer had. Pilot experience continued to erode. Veterans were lost faster than they could be replaced. New pilots entered combat with fewer hours and less confidence, facing an enemy whose system forgave inexperience through structure and redundancy. American bomber forces, by contrast, expanded relentlessly. Aircraft arrived faster than losses could deplete them. Crews rotated through combat tours. Doctrine evolved incrementally, but never retreated. Strategically, the implications were severe. Then, industrial centers, airfields, and logistics hubs were vulnerable by default. Air defense shifted from prevention to mitigation. Resources were spread thinner across a widening front. The psychological impact was just as damaging. Interception was no longer a guarantee of control. It became a gamble, sometimes successful, often costly. Confidence eroded not through defeat, but through repetition without resolution. Could reshape the battlefield before ground forces ever arrived. The sky had become a domain not of duels, but of pressure. And once that pressure was established, it rarely relented. By the end of 1943, the balance in the air was no longer in question. What remained uncertain was only how long resistance could continue under its weight. That question of endurance versus inevitability would linger beyond this battle, beyond this year, and into the final chapters of the war itself. In the quiet that follows a battle, they had trained for decades to dominate the air, to bend engagements to their will, yet in 1943 they confronted a new reality. Courage alone could not overcome systemic endurance. American bomber formations proved that war could be waged as much with coordination, structure, and industrial scale as with individual brilliance. The white skies, once an eerie spectacle, became a symbol of this transformation, a reminder that modern air warfare demanded more than skill. It required discipline, repetition, and resilience. This confrontation also revealed the limits of doctrine built solely on historical success. What worked against scattered targets faltered against networks of firepower, organization, and overwhelming numbers. The Battle of the High Skies was not just a contest of aircraft, but of philosophy, the individual against the system, instinct against procedure, courage against endurance. For the men involved, the shock was personal. Veterans of earlier victories felt the fragile grip of confidence slip. Young pilots faced the realization that surviving the next encounter was as much a matter of cooperation as of reflex. And for history, the encounter became a pivot point. It signaled the emergence of industrialized air warfare, where fleets of machines and crews could shape outcomes more reliably than elite skill alone. It reshaped tactics, strategy, and expectations across the Pacific theater. Above all, it serves as a reminder that technology, doctrine, and human courage are intertwined, and that sometimes the sky itself can teach the hardest lesson. That bravery is never enough if it flies into a storm, built by countless unseen hands, and so the laughter that once greeted slow bombers vanished, leaving only the solemn understanding that the air belonged to those who could endure it.